Hi, this is Alyssa Tong, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Authentication and Authorization in Jenkins. Leading the webinar today is Jesse Glick. Jesse is developer and architect for CloudBees. Jesse is one of the key Jenkins contributors here at CloudBees, for which he was one of the early committers and developed the NetBeans IDE integration. Before I turn it over to Jesse, I just want to go over to some housekeeping notes. We are recording today's sessions, and we'll send out the link to the recording to anyone who registered for the session. Also, on the right-hand side of your WebEx control panel, please feel free to enter your questions throughout today's presentation. Jesse will answer them at the end of the webinar. So at this point, I will hand it over to Jesse.
Thanks, Melissa.
Yep.
So let me display my web browser so that you can see some demos. Just a moment. Okay, are we visible?
Yes.
Great. Thanks everyone for coming. Today we're going to talk about authentication and authorization in Jenkins. So I think most of you will know Jenkins is a popular open source continuous integration tool. CloudBees makes a value-added version called Jenkins Enterprise that provides a number of additional plugins or features that are especially suitable for large organizations, people who have large Jenkins installations or need special support. So what we're talking about today is the special features for managing users and what they're permitted to do in Jenkins. As you can see, I'm running Jenkins Enterprise by CloudBees 12.11, so that's the most recent version that was just released a couple weeks ago. And you see here a pretty basic Jenkins home screen where not much has been done so far.
Jesse, I think we've lost your screen.
Okay, let me try that again.
There we go.
All right, can we see it now?
It's currently blue and blank.
And blank. Okay, let's try this. Can you see it?
Yes.
Great. Let me know if it drops off again.
Okay.
So let's go to the Manage Jenkins link. This is just the overall configuration for the system. And we're going to click on Configure System to show how Jenkins is set up overall here. What I'm going to be focusing on is this section that's available after I click Enable Security. So the initial setup of Jenkins has no security setup. You have to turn it on if you want that. And what I'm interested in talking about today is the access control section. So this pertains to who Jenkins users are and what they're able to do. And these things are actually split out into two components by Jenkins, and you can have different plugins that offer each of these aspects independently. So first of all, the security realm, which would also be known as authentication, determines what logged in users of Jenkins are, who they are, and what sort of external characteristics they have. And there are a number of different security realms that either come bundled in Jenkins or in Jenkins Enterprise or that you can download separately. So for example, if you're running on a Windows server, you can use Active Directory services, which means that people can log in using their Active Directory account. There's a similar system for Unix user database if you prefer to use that. If Jenkins is running on Unix, you can use LDAP directory services and so on. You can also add plugins to let people log in via GitHub or via different kinds of single sign-on systems. For purposes of this demo, I'm just going to use a special security realm that is provided by a plugin I wrote specifically for testing out authorization. And all this plugin does, it doesn't really secure anyone. It just lets you define a list of fake users for testing purposes. All of these users are going to have a password that's the same as their username. So you can try logging in as different people to see what happens. And after each user, you can also give one or more external group names. So an external group is something that is defined by the security realm, and it would be a list of users that's named somehow. So in Active Directory, you might have domain users or administrators. LDAP, you can have various other groups as well. If you're using Jenkins' own user database where people just sign up in Jenkins itself without any external system, then there are no groups. But here I want to show how groups can be used together with Jenkins Enterprise features. So I'm going to define a few of them. Sudo here is similar to a group available on some Unix systems, for example. And then in the next section, we have authorization. So this is a list of what people can do at different times. By default, anyone, whether they're logged in or not, can do anything. There are a couple of authorization modes that are built into Jenkins, such as matrix-based security and project-based matrix authorization strategy. These are available in Jenkins open source. And these just let you give simple lists of permissions that different people can have. And you can see various permissions listed across here with tooltips. That's suitable for smaller installations or for less complex setups. But in a lot of large environments, you might have more specialized needs. And so we're going to enable role-based matrix authorization strategy. This is provided by the role-based access control plugin, which is part of Jenkins Enterprise and one of its key features. So if I click that option and hit save, the first thing that's going to happen is that I'm asked to log in. I was not logged in as anyone before. We'll see in a moment why that's necessary. So login is Alice, password Alice here for testing. Login is Alice, and the first thing we'll notice is that two new links appeared on the sidebar of Jenkins, groups and roles. I'll get to groups in a moment. First, I want to talk about roles. I'm going to click on the Manage link so you can see some more details of these roles. There are two roles that come built in when you enable the plugin. Anonymous represents people who have not logged into Jenkins at all, so just casual internet users or something like this. And authenticated represents anyone who's logged in but with no other further discrimination. And along the top of the table, the columns represent different permissions. Some example permissions are job workspace. This lets you retrieve the contents of the workspace for a Jenkins job, the files that have been checked out from version control and that are being built. Basically, in Jenkins authorization, there are three things to consider: the subject, the verb, and the object. The subject would be a user like Alice. There's Alice. The verb would be one of these permissions, like configuring a job. And the object would be a particular thing that you're trying to configure or build or delete, such as a job or Jenkins itself. So role-based access control lets you define precisely who should be able to do what to what objects. Before we start managing and configuring all of this, I just want to show a handy link, which we'll be referring back to throughout the demos, which is called Roles Who Am I? And this just gives a summary of who the currently logged in user is. So it gives the username, Alice, and it says what external groups Alice is a member of. Authenticated just means anyone who's logged in, so that's always there. And sudo was an external group that we defined in the mock security realm for Alice to be part of. Right now, that doesn't mean anything because we haven't bound that external group to anything. So what we're going to do is, in the Manage Role screen, we're going to create a user-defined role. So let's call this Administer. All right, so in the Administer role, we're going to click on the Overall Administer checkbox. So this permission is the permission to do anything you like to Jenkins. When I click that, you'll notice that all of these other permissions were highlighted in yellow. What that means is just that they're all implied by this permission. If you could do anything to Jenkins, then you can do all of these other things as well automatically. Just to make that explicit, I'm going to click the Check All button just to demonstrate that we really want anyone with this role to be able to do everything. And we're also going to want to turn off all of these permissions for all authenticated users. We don't want everyone who's logged in to do everything, so we'll click Uncheck All next to Authenticated. If I try to save that right now, the RBAC plugin throws up a warning sign that, hold on, you can't quite do that yet because of a possible lockout. I'll talk a little bit more about lockouts later, but that would be a condition where the administrator can't revert the decisions. So we're not going to do that just yet. We're going to leave authenticated users with all permissions in the save. So now that we've defined some roles, you can click on the roles link and you can see them here. Authenticated people and people with the administer role have all of the available permissions. And to go into groups. So groups in Jenkins are sets of users or other groups of different kinds that are granted different roles. So what I want to do is create a new group. And I'm going to call this group sysadmins, system administrators. And I want to grant sysadmins the administer role, so they should be able to do everything. So I click Granted. Don't worry about the propagates column for now. We'll get to that later. And I click Save. So now in the sysadmin summary, you can see that sysadmins are granted the administer role, and here we have a summary of all of the different roles that means. Currently, there are no members. I want to add one. So I'm going to say Add User to Group, and click on Sudo. Click OK. If you look at the icon for this, it says External Group. So Sudo was something that I defined in my mock security realm. This is a set of users, which currently just includes Alice herself, that we're going to want to make part of the sysadmins group. If you go back to roles who am I now, you can see that Alice is in the Jenkins sysadmins group by virtue of being in the sudo external group. And because she's in the sysadmins group, she gets the administer privilege. So Alice can now do everything. So now what we can do is go back to roles and manage, and now we can finally turn off the global permissions for authenticated users. We have at least Alice being able to do everything because she's an administrator. We do decide in this instance that we want everyone who's logged in to at least be able to see things. So I'm going to give overall read permission and a couple other related permissions such as view read, job discover. So these permissions just mean that anyone who's logged in will at least be able to see what's going on in Jenkins, even if they can't change anything. I'll save that. So what happens if we log in as a different user other than Alice, say Bob? So Bob is now logged in. And if we go to roles who am I, we see that Bob is in no particular Jenkins groups, and so he has no permissions. So Bob can browse around different projects in Jenkins, but he can't build them, he can't configure them, he can't delete them. Bob can't really do anything in particular except look at what's going on. So we'll log out Bob and go back to Alice. What we next want to do is define a more interesting role, which we'll call develop. So a develop role is going to mean someone who is a source code developer. So what should developers be able to do? Well, as administrator, you get to pick exactly what that means, but I would let them create new jobs, maybe not delete them. That might throw away valuable information. Configure the jobs so you can change how they're set up, build them, look at the workspace, cancel builds. We don't want to let them move jobs elsewhere for now. They can create and update particular builds. They can skip building a job temporarily. This is a Jenkins Enterprise feature in this column. And we probably want to let them create different views of jobs, read, configure, delete, create, so that they can group jobs however makes sense to them, and create source control tags corresponding to particular builds. So good enough for the developer role. So we see it listed here. It's not currently granted to anyone, as opposed to administer, which is granted to everyone in the sysadmins group. So we can change that by going back to groups, and let's make a new group. We'll call this one developers. We're going to grant them the developer role, no big surprise. And we'll add the dev external group. Oops, let's try typing that again. Add the dev external group to the developers Jenkins group. You can create as many groups as you want. So you might want to create a group called testers, and we're not going to give them any roles right now, but we can add some people to it, such as the QA group. Currently that just has Debbie in it. So now we have a few different groups available. And if you go back to the roles overview screen, we can see that now everyone in the developers group has a develop role. So let's test this out. We'll log in as a different user, Charlie. Let's get a summary of who Charlie is here. Charlie's in the dev group, therefore he's in the developers Jenkins group, and therefore he should have the develop permission. When I'm logged in as Charlie, now I can do things like create a new job because I'm in the develop group, so I can do things like that. I can create jobs and configure them. I do not have a manage Jenkins link here because I'm not a system administrator, so I can't make changes to the set of slave computers attached to Jenkins or anything like that. So let's log back in as Alice, a system administrator. And I'm going to show how you can offer additional possibilities, additional permissions, only for a particular job, not overall. So I'm going to click on the public job, and now click groups in the sidebar. And now if you pay attention to the URL up here, you can see that this is groups just for the public job, groups defined in public. Currently there are no groups defined in public. It's just picking up any groups that are defined in Jenkins overall. But I want to add one. Call this public testers. The testers of the public job, I'm going to grant the develop role for now. And if I go to add users group, then I can add testers, or Jenkins completing the group name for me. You'll notice that I picked a different name from testers for this local group because I didn't want to have confusion with the global group. So if you see this, now we have a local group public testers, including a global group, all of the QA people, so Debbie, and this will have the develop role. So if we go back to roles for public, and now we see a slightly different view than we saw before. So sysadmin's global group has a role in the public job, but it's in italics. That indicates that this is an inherited group. It's coming from Jenkins overall. Similarly, for the developers inherited group, public testers here is in bold because that's a local group. So it's a group that is only meaningful in this one job. So let's try logging out and logging in as Debbie. When we log in as Debbie, we have no permissions to say, build Charlie's job or to create a new job or anything. So Debbie does not have general permissions overall. You can check that here. Nothing, no special roles. But within public, if you look at roles, who am I, then Debbie does have developer role because she's part of the local group public testers. And so within public, Debbie can configure, make all kinds of changes, whatever she needs to do. So let's log out. Let's go back to being Alice, the system administrator. What you'll notice is that we had to make changes specifically to the public job in order to grant these special permissions to testers like Debbie. And that's fine if you just want to do this for 1 or 2 jobs. But if you have 50 or so jobs that are all very similar that you want to apply the same kinds of permissions to, you definitely don't want to be repeating all of this configuration over and over. So in order to solve that, we use a feature of Jenkins Enterprise called folders. And folders group jobs together and can apply similar permissions across all of them. So let's pretend that we're creating the next generation of a software project, and we call it Nextgen in the folder. So everything in this folder is going to be related to this software product. Let's go ahead and create a new job inside Nextgen. Let's call it base for the core of the product. Don't need to configure anything for it. So now we have a Nextgen folder and a base project inside of the Nextgen folder. So what I want to do is give certain permissions that are only going to apply to the Nextgen folder and not to Jenkins as a whole. The way I do that is, again, I go to groups and I define a group within the Nextgen folder. So let's call this Nextgen team lead. And Nextgen team leaders, I'm going to grant the administrator role. And I'll add everyone who's in the lead external group. This is currently just Bob. So let's see what happens when I log in as Bob now. So Bob has no overall administrator permission. You can't configure Jenkins. But when Bob's inside Nextgen, then basically he's king of this domain. So he can do all sorts of things like make new jobs and add-ons. Job, say, is an extra job that Bob wants to create inside Nextgen. Bob can do all kinds of things in here as well, like configuring the appearance of the view for Nextgen. Say Bob doesn't want the last duration button or column to appear in the view. Or you can make other kinds of changes, putting the build button up top, something like that. So Bob can make all of these kinds of changes within the Nextgen folder, but not outside of it. So the next question that comes up, let's log out as Bob and back in as Alice, is what if we want to further restrict things so that only certain people can work on the Nextgen folder? So until now, we've only been adding permissions for nested items like folders and jobs, but sometimes we want to actually subtract them. Let's pretend that the Nextgen project is rather fragile and we don't want just anyone making changes or creating jobs in it. So we can set that up. Let's go into Nextgen and we'll create a group of people that we believe ought to be able to make developer type activities in Nextgen. So we'll call it Nextgen developers, grant them the developer's role. And we'll just add Debbie. So we'll pretend that even though Debbie isn't normally in the development team for the Nextgen project, we want to let her do whatever she wants in here in terms of creating and configuring jobs. So in order to block other developers from creating and configuring jobs in Nextgen, which currently they can do, as you can see here. We want to click on this filter link. So filter is what lets you subtract permissions in a nested item. So if I click the button next to filter and develop, then this means that in order to have the develop role on this folder, you have to specifically have been granted it. If I hit apply, then we'll see that in the develop row of the roles summary, the Nextgen developers have the develop role, but global developers do not. So we can test this out by going in as Charlie. Charlie is a developer normally, so Charlie can create new jobs, build jobs, and so on. But within Nextgen, Charlie can't create new jobs. Charlie cannot build Nextgen projects or do anything else. He can only see what's happening. So this is a good start, but perhaps Nextgen is so sensitive that we really don't want anyone even looking at it. So let's say this is a secret project that we don't want leaked to the outside world. So how can we make this truly secret? What we have to do is go to roles and go back to filter again. And let's filter out authenticated now. So normally the authenticated role that we set up lets anyone who's logged in look at everything in the system. But I'm going to cancel that for this folder only. So if I hit apply, then we see we have no roles for authenticated in this folder. So what happens if we log in as Charlie now? Well, Charlie can still build jobs and see his own job and the public job and everything, but there's no Nextgen folder. As far as Charlie's concerned, this is just gone. And even if Charlie got a special link to it by accident, if he tries to go to it, he'll just get a 404. It's as if this folder doesn't even exist. He can't tell that it's there. By the way, there's a subtle distinction in permissions that you can see if you go to manage roles between job discover versus job read. Discover means figuring out that a job exists, whereas read means seeing details about it. It's possible to grant someone the discover role, the discover permission, but not the read permission. If they do that, then they can, if they try to browse to a particular job's URL or folder's URL, instead of getting a 404, they'll just be asked to log in or be told that they can't access it. So that's a little less secure, but maybe a little bit friendlier. So let's say Bob actually wanted to go a little bit further in locking down this folder. And he decided to filter out even the administrator role. So Bob is saying, not only do I not want random people looking at this folder, but I don't want system administrators to be making changes to it either. So Bob locks it out, and Bob can still use Nextgen. But what happens when Alice comes in? So now Alice is prevented from looking at the Nextgen folder either. And this is probably not good because Alice is supposed to be the overall system administrator. She may have a shell account to log into the system and might be responsible for tracking any kinds of failures anywhere. So she doesn't want to be locked out of anything. That's no good. How can she prevent that? By going back to this filterable column in the Manage Roles screen. By default, roles are filterable, so it means that it's permissible to block them out of a nested item. But we want to prevent that from happening for the administer role. So we'll unclick administer here. And now, as Alice, we can go back, and Alice, once again, it can be an administrator in Nextgen and see everything in it. In fact, Bob can no longer even try to filter Alice out of the Nextgen folder, because if he tries to go to filter, then the administer role has disappeared from this list of things that you can filter out. So next I'd like to talk about a relatively advanced feature of the RBAC plugin, which is called pinned roles. So in order to demonstrate this, I'm going to create a new role that I'll call notice. And notice is going to be a pretty weak role. It's just going to let you, it's going to be similar to authenticated. You can see that jobs are there. Just for fun, we'll also give you the ability to see groups and roles so that you can see what the security configuration is without being able to change any of it. And we'll save that role. And then we'll go into the Nextgen folder and create a local group called Nextgen Notified, which will grant the notice role. This time we're going to uncheck the propagates checkbox. So what this means is that the notice role will be granted on the folder itself, but it will not be granted on anything inside the folder. It will not be granted any of the jobs that are contained in it. So when you save that, you see that we get a new icon, non-inheritable or pinned role. You can see a hat with a little pin in it. So this is a group that only has a pinned role on it, and we're going to add some users to it. And we're just going to add the dev external group for testing. Now let's log in as Charlie, who's in this dev external group. Now Charlie can see that Nextgen exists. Okay, so that's good. But if Charlie goes into it, then he can't see any of the contents of Nextgen. So he can just see that there is such a folder. This is not like the NSA. There is such a folder, but you can't be told anything about it. And we've given Charlie the ability to click on the roles link so that you can see why he can't see any details, because this table cell is missing. You can't look at anything inside of it. So let's log back in as our system administrator, Alice. And we're going to show one other trick, which is letting non-system administrators perform some kind of limited configuration of security themselves in a safe way. So in order to do this, let's create a new role. We'll call sign up. And in sign up role, you're going to be able to view roles, view groups, and we'll grant one more permission, which is group manage. There's a very important distinction between managing and configuring a group. Managing a group means that you can add people to it or remove them. So you can change the membership of it. Configure lets you change what roles the group is granted. So configuring, if you can configure a group, then you can grant it any role, such as administrator. So that's pretty powerful. But we're not going to let people in this role do that. We're only going to let them change the members. So we create that role. And then we're going to create a new folder, which we'll call Playpen. And this is just going to be a scratch area for people to experiment in. Set that. So here's our Playpen folder, and this is still Alice, the system administrator, is working here, and she's setting this up. She's going to make a new local group called Play People. And Play People, we're going to give both the sign up and the develop roles. So this is why we didn't give very many permissions to sign up itself, because we're combining it with the existing develop role. And initially, we're just going to add the developers global group to this group. So if we looked at roles of Playpen, then you can see that anyone who's in Play People gets the develop role and the sign up role. So between those two roles, they can create all kinds of jobs, configure them. They can't delete other people's jobs, but that's all right. And they can manage groups. So what's the effect of this? Let's try logging in as someone who's in the developers group, Charlie. So now inside Playpen, Charlie can create a test job of some kind that he wants to experiment with. Fine. But Charlie can also go to the groups link here. Charlie cannot create new groups, but he can look at the Play People group. And there's no configure link over on the side here. So Charlie can't change the fact that this group has only these two roles. But he can add a user group. So Charlie got a request from Debbie to be able to experiment with jobs. And so he wants to add her to this playpen as well. So now Charlie's just extended the group members within this area without having overall administrator permission to Jenkins. He's only allowed to do this within this one folder. And if we log in as Debbie, we see that now Debbie does have access to Playpen, and she can create her own test projects in this area as well. And in this case, Debbie also, Debbie is also now someone who is able to make changes to the Play People group, so she can sign up other people and so on. So there's just one more thing that I want to talk about as far as access control goes and how that works with Jenkins. Sometimes people try to set up access control on a view and are surprised by the fact that it doesn't seem to do what they want to do. So if we created a view, which is just basically a named list of jobs, let's say Charlie job in public, and you can make various changes to the appearance of the view. Let's put a name column first instead of in third position, and so on. If you have permissions to edit this view, that just brings you to the screen, and all you can do is change what appears in the view. That does not grant you permission to change any of the jobs in the view. In order to change Charlie job or build it, or change public or build it, etc., you have to have those permissions some other way. So the view is just a alternate display mode. And another thing that people might get tripped up on is that if you have a list of slaves, these are attached computers that you can run builds on in Jenkins. Here we have a general purpose slave machine that we can use to run builds. Well, you can configure roles and local groups on a slave. It might be a little bit misleading because all of the job-related permissions will never be used, will never be considered when you're talking about the slave, because the only thing you can do to a slave is configure it, delete it, create it, connect it, disconnect it. These are the only verbs that apply to a slave. So if you want to prevent arbitrary people from running jobs on a particular slave, then you have to do something else. And this is another feature of Jenkins Enterprise. So let's pretend we have a slave called privileged. This might either be an expensive piece of hardware that we don't want just anyone running builds on, or it might be a computer that has a predefined connection to a secure database or has some passwords on it. So it wouldn't be secure to let just anyone run builds on it. So how can we prevent arbitrary people from running builds whenever they like it on the slave? We have to configure it and say only accept builds from approved folders. And save. And now let's go back to Jenkins configuration and open the Nextgen folder. Let's say that Nextgen products are the only ones that are supposed to be built on this privileged slave. So we click on the controlled slave link and say create a request. We have a two-step authentication process because the people who can manage a folder are not necessarily the same as the people who can manage a slave. We'll just copy the request key and go back to the slave and say, yes, I would like to build request using this request key. And the slave gives you back a secret. We copy that and paste it in here. In general, this might be done over email or chat or something if a folder maintainer wants to ask for this permission. And now Nextgen says that privileged is a controlled slave that I can build on. Similarly, in the privileged slave, its screen says that it can accept builds from the Nextgen folder. Let's test this out. I'm going to make a job they'll call special needs, and the only thing interesting about this job is that it can only run on privileged. So try and build it. This is inside Jenkins at top level, and I asked to build now. And it goes into the queue, and then it says, oh, it's just waiting for the privilege node. And it's going to be waiting there forever because the privilege node is not going to accept it right now. It's not authorized. So I'm just going to cancel that request right now. It's not going to work. What I need to do is select move and move it into the Nextgen folder. And now if I build it, build scheduled, and a build ran, and we can see that this build, in fact, ran on our privileged slave. So if we go back to the privileged slave, we can see that it can accept jobs built from the Nextgen folder, and if you go to build history, all you're ever going to see in this build history until you change the configuration is jobs from Nextgen. So that's about what I have for demos. We can open it up for questions.
Thanks, Jesse. So we did have a few questions that came in. The first question is, what do I do if I accidentally lock even the administrator out of the system? How can I recover?
Right. So when we were initially setting up the RBAC plugin, we saw that it wasn't a configure system, but when we initially tried to turn off most permissions and click save, that the plugin prevented you from making that change because it was afraid you were going to lock even Alice out of being able to make further changes. But under some conditions, it is possible to lock yourself out anyway if you do exactly the wrong things in the wrong order later. And so you need to be able to recover so that Alice is able to restore the system to a working state. So in order to do that, let's just take a look at system information. You can see the Jenkins home here, this directory. Let's browse that. So this is the configuration directory on disk. So not going through the web UI, but if you logged into the Jenkins master machine and opened up the Jenkins home directory, you see that there are various configuration files. There's the Jenkins global config.xml. And one way we can use to recover is to find where it says use security true and just change that back to false. So that will temporarily disable all security on the instance, and then you can go and try to recreate the right setup. That's a little drastic. Something you might prefer to do instead is open up the nectar rbac.xml file and either delete it, so resetting the global role and group configuration to all of its default values, or figure out what the last change you made was that was a problem and try to undo it. So you can just go and remove a role or add a permission back to a given role or something like that to do the minimum amount you need to get it back to a sane state. But normally this is not necessary because as long as you didn't completely lock yourself out, then you just need to make sure that filterable is unchecked for some kind of administer role, and then you should be able to do everything you need to. Okay, were there other questions?
Yes. So the next question is, can I let some users look at job configurations but not make changes?
Yes. So by default in Jenkins, we just have a single permission called configure, which means that if you go into a job, let's take Charlie's job, that we see a configure link on the side of the screen, and you click on it and you will see what the current configuration of the job is, and you can make various changes and click save. In some cases, you want people to be able to see the configuration of a job just so that they can maybe debug build failures or something like that, but not necessarily change it. We want to reserve that for other people. If that's the case, then we want to look for it's called extended permissions. That's an extended read permission plugin. So this is a special plugin that exposes a new permission, which is view configuration. And when you have this plugin installed, then you can grant people the ability to view configuration without actually making changes. And then this would show up in the roles managed screen next to job configure. You would get view configuration. Okay, anything else?
The last question is, if a secret job is being built or in the build queue, will users without access to that job be able to see it?
Right, so this would mean, I think I had I'm not sure if I had Charlie locked out of Nextgen. Yeah, so Charlie, for example, in this case, can see that there's an Nextgen folder, but cannot see what any of the jobs in it are. So the question is, what happens? Let's go back as Bob and change one of these jobs to be building for a while. Add a build step. I'm going to say sleep 60. Save and build. So now Bob can see that there's a Nextgen base project and it's currently building. If I log in as Charlie, who isn't normally able to see anything in Nextgen, he can't see Nextgen base, all he can see here is that we're building an unknown job. So he knows that something is happening that's using up this executor, but he can't see any details about it. So we still preserve security that way. Okay, do we have anything else?
Nope, that's all the questions that we have.
All right, well, I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and we'll pass it back to Melissa.
Well, thank you, Jesse, for delivering today's webinar. So we wanted to also thank everyone for attending. We hope you found it valuable, and we hope you have a great day.